Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Grand Rounds. It's actually quite hard to introduce your boss and introduce Dr. Robert Wachter in particular without sounding like, you're reading his Wikipedia page or you're giving him another Lifetime Achievement Award. Many people know Bob is a past president of the Society of Hospital Medicine and a former chair of the American Board of Internal Medicine. He's also an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, which is medicine's highest honor. And of course, he's our department chair here at UCSF in the Department of Medicine. Bob has had a unique career in really helping us understand and make sense of these big radical shifts that have happened through the course of clinical medicine, things like the movement of patient safety and quality, the EHR and digital transformation. He often helps those around him make sense of these changes even years before they fully are implemented, and really tells us what we should be paying attention to. He has, of course, famously coined the term of hospitalist, was one of his biggest legacies in really changing the field of medicine. His newest book, A Giant Leap, tackles another force that's reshaping our clinical and academic lives, which is artificial intelligence. I have read the book and just loved it. It approaches the topic in typical Bob style with a lot of curiosity, trying to help us understand why these shifts matter, where they could go wrong, how to navigate this without really losing our professional identity or without losing our humanity. I always say Bob has this interesting ability to see around corners and see what we might not see yet, both in the pearls and the pitfalls of new technology, and loves to put his nickel down and place a bet on how things are going to shape for the future of new technologies, which is why it makes such a fun interview to see how Bob really places AI and integrates it into our clinical and academic lives. So we are incredibly lucky to have his voice guiding us through this next leap. I'm thrilled to talk with him today about what AI may mean for the future of medicine and for all of us in this room. So thank you, Bob, for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. That was lovely. Really appreciate it. Just to point out that this first slide here, this was made by Nano Banana, which is the image generator on Gemini, which is Google's tool. And I put into it that I'm optimistic about where this is all going. And I said I'm optimistic really for two reasons. And one is that generative AI, the new AI, is really remarkable, and also because healthcare is in such dire straits and needs the help. And so that is what it drew in about 3 seconds after putting in those prompts. It's pretty amazing.
So I guess my first question is, how has the reception of the book been? What has the feedback been?
So first of all, here's the book. The feedback has been mostly wonderful. I have to say, I don't know if Andy Josephson is watching, but Andy is co-chairing the Health System Strategy Committee with me. And for the past year or so, I've been obnoxious. I just bring up AI all the time, talking about doing this, doing that. And I would say, what about AI? What about AI? Finally, a couple of months ago, Andy said to me, I said, what about AI? And he stopped and he says, tell me how much money you make on every book sale. And I said, I make about $3. He said, if I give you $4, will you shut the hell up about AI? So, but it has been, I spent about 18 months writing it. I interviewed about 105 people from all sorts of walks of life, hoping that by the time it came out, it wouldn't be out of date. And came out last week, and obviously it's not out of date. It's hit a tremendous wave at this moment. It's the best-selling book on Amazon on the topic of computers and the topic of AI. I know that because Amazon changes its sales ranking every hour, and therefore I have to check Amazon every hour. The reviews have been wonderful, and I actually want to show you one review. I've had some reviews that said I can't put the book down, which is really quite nice. But maybe you can go to the next slide, Sam. This is my granddaughter in Atlanta, and she's the only one who actually can put the book down, as you will see.
We did them.
There we go. So that was a less than positive review, but everybody else has been really positive, and I appreciate that you seem to enjoy it as well. Thank you.
Yes, I definitely flew through it and appreciated all the stories and anecdotes along the way. So it's a would recommend from me. Um, I, I guess I'm curious, you of course have this persona of forecasting trends in healthcare and really helping us understand what are the changes that are going to affect the way we practice. And, AI feels to be that, but I'm curious, like, why write a book on it? What led you to write that book? And do you really feel like this is going to be a huge shift in the way we practice medicine, similar to the other topics that you've written about?
I think it's a bigger shift in the way we're going to practice medicine than anything I've ever written about. And you could argue, the hospitalist thing became the fastest growing specialty in history, so it was pretty consequential. But I don't think anything like this. I think this is a game changer that will change the practice of medicine in ways that almost are unimaginable today. And part of the challenge in the book was trying to imagine what that might look like. I'm not a technologist, as the people in the audience who actually understand what's happening under the hood know well. I don't. But I kind of am a student of the healthcare system. And that led me about 15 years ago to get extraordinarily interested in digital transformation. And in part because I'd been doing a lot of work in patient safety, and you couldn't work in patient safety without believing that if you look at all of these errors because of everything from doctor's handwriting to someone not knowing that that something that is a test result that didn't get transmitted from one place to another, you couldn't help but think that digital transformation was upon us. We were late to that dance. Most other industries, of course, have been transformed by technology. If you think about the way you buy things or the way you travel or the way you get your entertainment. And then about 15 years ago, we all implemented electronic health records. I was incredibly enthusiastic about that. I had no reason to believe that it wouldn't be as transformative or as positive as my iPhone. And then everybody was pissed about their electronic health record. And I asked people why, and the answers made no sense to me. So that was kind of my first foray into this, and wrote a book called The Digital Doctor 10 years ago, which was really the story of healthcare going from paper to digital and why it had not gone well. And the process of writing it was immensely interesting. My wife, who many people know is a world-class journalist, convinced me the only way I would get the story right was to go out and interview a ton of people and play amateur journalist. And so the book really was about why the electronic health record delivered on many things, but mostly did not deliver on the promise of transforming healthcare. And to summarize it in a line, we spend a huge amount of energy putting stuff into it and get so little useful intelligence and insight out of it. And at the end of the book, I had a chapter that people came up to me and said, "Who was your ghostwriter?" Because at the end of a kind of bummed out book is a pretty optimistic chapter. It was like, this is going to work out eventually, but the EHR was not it. It's foundational. We needed our data in digital form, but we needed something else to take all that data, make sense of it, and then deliver to us advice, recommendations, changes in workflow that would deliver on the promise. So I was sort of primed to believe that something was going to happen to make things better. But then the day I used ChatGPT for the first time, which was November 30th, 2022, when it first came out, a little light bulb went off and said, this is it. And really that slide, it was the combination of this technology is unlike anything we've seen before, in that you can say to it, I've got an 82-year-old patient who's got CLL, who comes in with a fever, a white count, creatinine of 2.7, an infiltrate on chest X-ray, and abnormal LFTs and a transaminase pattern. What do you think is going on? I mean, you couldn't do that with UpToDate. You couldn't do that with Google. You couldn't do that with anything. So the ability of it to understand language, to process it, and to give human-like responses, I thought was remarkable. And that combined with the sorry state of healthcare, just a little light bulb went off. And to me, it was obvious that this was going to be the transformative moment. And I use the old Hemingway line in the book. One of the characters in The Sun Also Rises went bankrupt. Somebody says, how does a man go bankrupt? And the answer was 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. So to me, this was that moment when we were going to be transformed. Seemed really interesting. Actually, my wife, Katie, said, you should write a book. You should write kind of a sequel. I, of course, said, no, I don't think so. 5 minutes after it's done, it'll be out of date. And she said, okay. And then the publisher called me and said, "Wouldn't you like to write a book about it?" And maybe because it wasn't my wife, I said, "Yeah, good idea." So decided to do it, and actually found it quite useful to worry about how do you write a book that is not out of date when GPT goes from 5.3 to 5.4. And that really forced me to think hard about the big picture issues, like what are not focus on the state of today's technology, but what are the issues that arise when a technology that's smarter than we are enters a high stakes field like medicine and is not perfect. How does it change what it means to be a doctor, a patient, an educator, a nurse, a healthcare leader? So that's how it happened.
Awesome. No, I remember that last slide in many of your presentations. It was like, once we've digitized, here is what's possible. We can look at all that data. We can see trends. We can look at that data. We can help steer people on the right path. The technology just wasn't there yet. And the labor involved in doing so was so great. And then, so it makes perfect sense that once AI comes along, it's the next way to make use of all of that digital data.
Use of the data. And I'm also influenced by my older son, who is the father of that lovely little girl, who does baseball analytics for the Atlanta Braves. And I've seen what it looks like when an industry takes every piece of data they collect and says, let us analyze this up the yin yang and use it as business intelligence to make us better at what we do, which in their case is playing baseball. And we do so little of that, and yet all the data is in the system. And part of it was very, very expensive and labor intensive to extract it. But part of it is we didn't have the kinds of tools that we now have to do that.
I think what's so fun about the book is all the people that you talk to and the ways in which you find throughout medicine all the various ways AI is being used now, could be used in the future. And so I think that makes it it's going to make it have more longevity, because it really is about all of the potential that you've seen through all the people you talk to. I think furthering on that, we all can imagine AI doing administrative tasks. Like, yes, please, AI, can you code my chart for me? Like, that seems like a perfect, use case for AI. Prior authorizations, all these administrative tasks where there's been so much burden, everybody's really excited about. And then comes this tool where it actually can do diagnostic reasoning too. It can recognize patterns in a way that feels so intrinsic to our role as a physician. And so I'm curious, in some studies, AI has shown to be better alone than AI plus a physician, which really raises questions about what AI tasks should be done by AI alone. Where should there be, quote, as you call it, a physician in the loop? So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you see this physician AI partnership moving forward, and where we should expect AI to work autonomously, and where there is, at least for the foreseeable future, going to need to be a physician in the loop.
Yeah, short answer is I don't know. I think this is going to change a lot. I mean, think about, even as you said, it's almost no brainer that we're going to use these tools to be a digital scribe or to write a prior auth. 3 years ago, all those things were inconceivable. And so it's amazing. For example, the digital scribe went from I can't believe this thing works, to now kind of a ho-hum commodity. Of course, I now have a digital scribe. What else can you do for me? But this has happened very quickly, and we're not known in healthcare for rapidly implementing technology tools outside of very specific areas in radiology or in the OR. And so that all happened very quickly. But I agree with you. I think the kind of blockbuster, jaw-dropping moments were less about it can listen to a doctor-patient conversation and create a note, sort of described in exactly the right format and all that. That's pretty cool. But the real jaw-dropping stuff is when I can pick up my phone and get an answer about a complex question. We're both generalists. So one of the things I always say to people who are thinking about being a hospitalist or a primary care doc, your ego has to be comfortable with the fact that there's no problem that you can see, that there aren't 5 people in the building who know more about it than you do. And where you live is you know more about the whole thing than they do. And so the ability to scale the knowledge of such specialists and make it accessible to generalists is really quite striking. Now, is it as good as going up to your friendly gastroenterologist or cardiologist? Probably not quite, but it's better than nothing, and often nothing is the alternative. in the early days, as I was following this, you saw AI pass the boards and pass the medical licensing exams. Like, okay, that's fine. And then you saw it do really quite well against the New England Journal clinical problem solving cases. And if you want to read something wild, if you haven't read it, watching Gurpreet essentially take on the Mass General's AI bot and luckily do a little better, but only a little, it was a remarkable case in the New England Journal. But then, as okay, it can solve a complex case. Then, wow, it's actually pretty good at empathy. Actually, it has no empathy. It doesn't know the difference between empathy and a recipe for a hamburger helper, but it can fake empathy incredibly well. And then I'd say one of the real shocking studies, the first one was a Stanford and Harvard study, and there have been others now that showed that docs by themselves did a certain way on diagnostic reasoning. With AI, they did a little bit better, but the best was AI by itself, which says that the intervention of the physician in that case actually degraded the performance. That's actually not surprising. As the AI gets better and better, it wouldn't be shocking that you reach a level of performance where if your system for safety is the AI does its thing, and then the doctor or a nurse or whoever looks over its shoulder and is the final arbiter, if the AI is better and smarter than the human, then the human's intervention will degrade the performance. So that has to be balanced against the fact that we still want an accountable human being. We still want someone to send a bill off to the insurance company. At least for now, the AI doesn't have malpractice insurance, although there's a company actually out of UCSF that's now doing this prescription refill thing in Utah, and they bought malpractice insurance. So I learned about this issue. Julia Milstein sitting here, she and I and another colleague in Toronto wrote a paper a few years ago about the human in the loop. And it was really influential in my thinking as I think about some of the big picture issues that emerge. I'd say the way I frame this one is the AI now, whether it's in creating a note or writing a prior auth or in diagnosis, the AI now is good enough to be useful and not perfect enough to be entirely trusted. And therefore, the system of safety is the AI will do its thing and the human will be the final arbiter. And you have all sorts of interesting problems that arise from that. This one, which is sometimes the AI is better than the human and the human will screw things up. But sometimes even when the human is useful, how good are humans at staying awake and alert if the AI has been right 50 times in a row? We're awful at that. Remaining vigilant if you have a technology tool that you've come to trust. And then there's a huge problem of de-skilling, where over time, maybe you used to be very good at the thing, but as the more you have become dependent on the AI, you're no longer as good at it. So I think this is one of the really fundamental questions to struggle with. Like, what does the system look like that takes a very useful and good AI, but maybe not perfect, a very good and useful human, but maybe not perfect, fuses them together? How do you ensure that that thing works as optimally? And in an environment that's highly regulated and an environment where a single bad error will be newsworthy, lawsuit worthy. And how do I know that? I know that because Waymo has driven over 100 million miles without a fatal accident. And yet 2 months ago, and I like cats, it's fine, but 2 months ago, it ran over a little Kit Kat in the Mission.
And the Waymo was later exonerated, by the way.
Was it exonerated? What?
When you looked at
it was the cat's fault? It was the cat's fault. But this became like a front page story in the New York Times that Waymo ran over the poor little bodega cat in the Mission. And how many cats have been run over by Uber drivers? How many cats have been run over by regular human drivers? There is this tendency with a new technology to see an N of one and just overreact to it. And I think that'll be one of the challenges going forward, because at some point, AI will harm and maybe even kill a human. And actually, we're seeing little versions of that with mental health chatbots, where you see examples of really pretty horrible things. And yet, people sometimes don't talk about millions of people getting essentially free mental health care that in general is pretty good.
It's been interesting reading your book while on the wards. It's caused me to reflect on the way I rely on AI now as a partner for hard diagnostic cases, or for like even really quick questions, in a way it can provide me a rapid answer more rapidly than reading a whole article.
And what are you using? Are you using regular one or open evidence?
Open evidence and ChatGPT. If I need at the highest level, if I need something more that focuses more on a better explanation with back and forth questioning, I use ChatGPT. If I'm like, give me the source, I want to see the source, I want to know you've used a trusted source, it's open evidence. But then you walk into a patient's room, and you touch on this in the book, and the nuance of these conversations and the shared decision making. It's just hard to imagine a world where that isn't always going to be hard. The humanity of medicine and the relationship of medicine and the need to partner with patients on decisions. You're talking about in the book, like the layer of what AI can do, and then that next layer of both complexity, humanity, partnership. I don't know. I'm curious if you have, you reflect on it really nicely at the end of the book. Any thoughts for people who are worried about like their future job?
Well, first of all, anxiety is a perfectly reasonable response at this moment. The last chapter of the book, I sort of did this thought experiment about a year and a half ago, where I was on the wards and tried to use AI all the time, to the point of obnoxiousness to my team. Like, I couldn't believe that I'm asking this, almost for everything. And really tried to imagine, if the AI gets even better, maybe at the same trajectory it's gotten better over the last 3 years, like, do I still have a job? And I really came down with the answer being yes, that the complexity of medicine, the humanity of medicine, the number of times where you're sort of bringing together different teams to do various things and communicating with patients and families. I felt quite comfortable that at least in this part of the work, there would be a job. Now, where hospital medicine probably lives somewhere in the middle of, replacing surgeons or interventional radiologists, even harder, replacing radiologists and pathologists, even easier. But I'm also taken by, I have a chapter in the book on radiology, which everybody thought would be the first field to go. After all, it really is looking at a collection of digital dots and saying this pattern appears to be lung cancer or whatever. How is that not replaceable? And in 2016, I guess it was, Jeff Hinton, the founding father of generative AI, winner of the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, gave a now infamous speech where he said we should stop training radiologists today because it's obvious that within 5 years they are toast. And for a couple of years, radiology applications by medical students tanked. And about 2 years later, they woke up and said the radiologists are doing fine and their incomes are fine, and there's a shortage, and applications rebounded. And if you ask our radiologists today, we can't hire them fast enough. So what we've seen, and the tools are getting better, and it's now quite clear that AI-aided mammography is better than regular mammography. We're going to see more of that. But I think what we have is, even in the most vulnerable fields like radiology or pathology, the demands and the volume increases and the spinning of the hamster wheel are so great that the incumbents actually are welcoming AI in just to get their day done, to get their work done.
I don't think that
that'll be true for a while.
Is super excited to read the like feeding tube X-ray. Like, yeah. They'd much rather read the complex stuff.
It would, although that poses an interesting problem. It's going to be true in primary care too. You can imagine a world where the job of primary care doctor, I see some on the back, Alan, and others, is undoable. Somehow you get through your day. But there was a study a couple of years ago that said, if the primary care doctors only did the preventive stuff they need to do, that's 27 hours a day. And that's if no patient has the temerity to show up sick. That's just 27 hours, just doing the stuff you're supposed to do. So you can imagine a world where the AI takes some of that off your plate. It handles the vaccinations, and I think you should. It handles hypertension. It handles your Wegovy. It handles your Lipitor. Great, but now the primary care doctor is left with the centrifuge sample of only the sick of the sick. So we have to account for that as the AI, and it's true in radiology too. If AI and radiology takes the easy stuff off their plate, and then you say, all right, we're going to expect you to do the same volume, but the only things you see now are the really complex cases, that's not going to work. So these are pretty...
Like a Moffitt rheumatologist.
Yes, same thing, exactly.
Awesome. One thing you touched on, you used the word de-skilling, which I think is a real concern with the advent of AI. My son proudly states like, Mom, I'm never going to need to drive a car. Like, why? I'm just going to own my own Waymo. Like, maybe he's right. I'm like, as long as I'm not the one driving you around, like this is fine.
Yeah.
Fine plan. And, I realized the other day, I don't know my sister. I'm very close with my sister. I do not know her cell phone number. I have tried to learn it.
Told me she's kind of pissed about that, but yeah.
I've tried to learn it so many times and they just can't stick because
I'm the same way.
That's it. And so like there is this fear that we will be de-skilled by technology, that maintaining a diverse set of skills is not possible when we have a technology that is so effective and efficient. And so I'm curious for the educators in the room, how do we use AI in a way that augments our knowledge? When is the right time to like introduce AI so that you've learned, and what should you have learned before you engage with AI? So many questions to ask for educators and students.
Yeah, I chaired a national commission for the Macy Foundation a year and a half ago on AI meets medical education. And we struggled with this one. There's a part of this that's obvious, which is we need to teach trainees about these tools, how to use them, when they work, when they don't work, how to recognize a hallucination, all that kind of stuff. That seems straightforward. Then when you say, and what should we take off the plate? There is, at least in this very diverse group of educators, there was uniform agreement on one thing. Anybody want to guess?
Yeah.
The Krebs cycle. That was the only thing everybody agreed on. And I think largely because everybody has PTSD. But for those of you not clinicians,
Anderson is
this bio,
no.
Not all of, no, immunology, we still need immunology, but the Krebs cycle, everybody agreed, we sweat and learn it and we never use it. But beyond that, at least to me at this point, while we believe that you need an expert in the loop, while I believe that using these tools effectively is actually a fairly complex cognitive act. And it's actually one of the real differences between us using these tools and patients using these tools. When I say this is an 82-year-old patient with CLLs, blah, 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 there's a huge amount going into taking the 50 facts that I might have at hand and distilling it down into the 7 things I'm going to load into the chatbot. That's an expert act. A novice, which is patients, can't do that. On the back end, when it comes out with, here are the possible diagnoses, and I look at the first 2 or 3 and say, oh yeah, those make sense, and I hadn't thought of that one, that's great. And then look at number 4 and say, no, that's ridiculous, that's not at play here. Again, an expert can do that, a novice can't, and patients are novices. So I think the tools for patients are gonna have to be more sophisticated than the ChatGPTs of the world. I think they're gonna have to be more doctor-like in that patient says, I've got a headache, and the tool says, oh, tell me more about it. And do your eyes hurt with the bright light? And does your neck hurt? So on and so forth. And it also knows your past history to give you a contextualized answer. But for physicians, I think that the de-skilling risk is very real. I think we have to be super careful about taking too much of the facts of medicine and diagnostic reasoning off their plates too soon. And then we have to actively think as educators, how do you prevent de-skilling? And that's a hard question. It happens very, very quickly. You may have seen the study that came out about a year ago from Europe, where colonoscopists were given access to an AI colonoscopy tool. And these tools are very cool. They put little green boxes around suspicious lesions. And they used it for 3 months, and they liked it and actually improved their performance. And then they turned the tool off. And their performance in the subsequent months was markedly worse than it had been before they ever used the tool. And you might say, oh, were these newbies? No, these were the average person in the study had 10 years of experience as a colonoscopy performer. So an experienced colonoscopist exposed to AI as a sidekick for 3 months became worse at their job. I think it's a really daunting problem. And you can see a doom loop here where if the humans get worse at this stuff, and we know what this looks like think about, you, Rebecca, you tell me, do you think our residents are as good at physical exam as they used to be? I don't think so. And in part, they de-skilled because the tools they have, everybody gets a CAT scanner and ultrasound, and they can do POCUS. So the tools they have made this thing that used to be super important, the physical exam, a little bit less important, and people naturally de-skill. So how do we deal with it? I think, making sure the trainees know that if they become dependent on these tools, they're actually going to be worse at their jobs. If we can figure out ways, and hopefully Julia and Sarah and others will figure out ways to use the tools so that we have the trainees weigh in first, for example, on diagnosis before it suggests. I think that's probably healthier than just dependent, you get a database and you just immediately throw it into open evidence and it gives you the answers. So I think we just got to be super thoughtful about this, but I think it's hard to know where this goes because over time, I think some de-skilling is inevitable. And, the automobile analogy is really quite important. Waymos are remarkably safe, but the alternative is looking at Tesla, and which I do not own, but I do know the Tesla's owner's manual has a line that I love. It was clearly written by a very expensive attorney with a very good sense of humor, because it says the auto self-driving mode does not make the vehicle autonomous and requires active driver supervision. Now, you could have a lot of chutzpah to be able to say this thing we call auto self-driving is not, basically what they're saying. But, what has happened? There have been 100 fatalities in Teslas where it was on that mode, and the car's about to drive into the side of a wall, and the driver either had de-skilled or more likely was just asleep at the switch. So this sort of human technology interface is incredibly complex. I don't think we know anything about it. And I think it's going to be a job of places like us that think about clinical care, but also education, to see if we can organize this in a way that maximizes the benefit and doesn't lead to a doom loop of people de-skilling, and therefore the default setting is to use the AI autonomously because the humans aren't any good at it anymore.
Yeah, ever since we had Adam here talking about how he interacts with generative AI, I've really changed my approach. I'm like, okay, I got to go first.
Yeah.
I have to here's what I'm thinking. And I try and ask it questions like, what am I missing? Or what questions am I not asking?
What's the worst thing this could be?
Exactly.
Maybe if you ask for the diagnosis, it gives you some diagnosis. If I miss something, the patient has a terrible outcome, what would this be? I think those are very useful questions. But as Julie and I wrote in this paper, the one analogy is TSA. I don't know if you know this, but TSA periodically throws in an image of a gun and a bomb to make sure that the TSA people stay awake and alert. I don't know if we want to throw out wrong diagnoses on purpose to make sure that people are staying awake and remaining good. But I think we've got to start being pretty creative about this, or we will blow it.
Excellent. You touched on a little bit about the role of ChatGPT or of any generative AI, especially for patients. And now specifically health-facing tools have been introduced. And that has implications both for patients, patient care, and for the clinicians that see them. And that coupled with EHR and shared notes, patients now have amazing tools at their disposal to interact with even before walking into a clinician visit. So I'm curious, just from the patient standpoint, are these tools safe? Was this a good decision to release a health-facing version? Especially since what you talked about, patients may not reliably put in the right things into the chat to get the right answer. And then I guess the follow-up question is, what does this mean for us as clinicians who are now interacting with patients who may come to the visit with a lot more medical knowledge, ideas, a treatment plan than they have before?
Yeah, and I'd even contextualize it further. In a world where people are less trusting of experts than they used to be and skeptical of organized, systems like health systems and doctors. So in general, I think this is healthy. I mean, I think that the democratization of care is in general a good thing. I think the healthcare system is overwhelmed, and if patients can get the information they need and it's reliable and trustworthy without necessarily needing to come in and see the doctor and interact with the system, I think that's net good. Should we have waited until the tools were better or perfect to roll them out? I don't think so. In part because I use Biden's line in the book quite a bit, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. For many patients, the alternative is I'm using a tool that may be imperfect, but it's still pretty smart. And the alternative is nothing. The alternative is my next available appointment is 3 months from now, or I live in a rural part of the state and there's no cardiologist or gastroenterologist or oncologist within 100 miles of here. And so I think a sort of uncomfortable period of experimentation where people they are going to use these tools. I mean, they're using them from everything else. Why would they not put in their health information? They will use these tools. There's no question about it. I think we need to build up some regulatory framework around them, or at very least some transparency where the tools are tested and the patients can see whether it works or not and make an informed choice about which tool to use. There's a paper just out today that in Nature that looked at some of these patient-facing tools, and they're very much imperfect. They are, I did the tech reporter for the Washington Post gave me 12 GPT health questions where GPT responded, and he asked me to sort of rate them. And most of the responses were great. We're fine. I think a patient relying on it would have been perfectly fine. And there were one or two that were just crazy and dangerous. And as I said, patients have no real ability to discern between the two. I think today, if I were a patient or as I look at my family, I don't think it's a bad idea to take, I mean, you go onto my chart and see your EKG is abnormal and your magnesium is low and try to figure out what it means, to put that information in and I think you get useful information out of it. I think that the final state will be better tools, as I say, more doctor-like, and I think embedded in the electronic health record. I mean, the fact that you've got to take your data now, port it out into GPT or into Claude seems silly when all your data is in your electronic health record. I think the final state here, and I assume Epic's working on this, will be that you are able to ask questions against your data in the electronic health record. For now, I guess I encourage people to use two different tools. I'm not sure that's better, but if I had a high stakes question that I'm putting into GPT, gives me an answer, I'd probably also put it into Gemini and see it gives me the same answer. I'd feel a little more comfortable, the same way that when I'm looking for a restaurant recommendation, I put it into Yelp and put it into TripAdvisor. And if they both agree, I feel a little more confident.
Yeah,
I think there's room to go here.
How many times I'm putting something into open evidence, I'm putting something into ChatGPT, and I'm like, okay, they say the same thing, and I have a reference here. Okay, I'm good.
Feel good. Yeah, and I think that's probably going to turn out to be useful, although I don't think there's any data to support that approach.
Yeah, it's funny. My mom texted me yesterday, and she's like, I'm getting a reclassed infusion tomorrow. What do I need to do? Like anything I need to know about? And at first I was like, reclassed? Like what? I don't know what that. And so I was like, but AI will know.
Something to do with bones, I think.
Yeah, it was zoledronic acid, so it's like, I like hypercalcemia. I got you. Zoledronic acid indications for inpatient hypercalcemia, fine. But I don't know how to prepare. It felt like a very much let me Google that for you moment where I just put it into ChatGPT and then I found a way to like translate it for my mom and give her the answer. So it's like, okay, there is something to this.
Yeah.
Allowing patients to have that information. I just, then when you're the physician on the receiving end, trying to parse how this patient got to where they are of what they think the next step should be or what they're worried their symptoms would be. I mean, that's a whole nother layer of complexity, especially if you have physicians or a patient who's highly complex, has a lot of like symptoms that don't fit well together. ChatGPT is getting them an answer. You're like, how did they get there? Yeah. And then what do I think of this? It's a huge cognitive load for a clinician.
Yeah, I think when I started playing with, I think I made a mistake extrapolating too closely, like how does it feel when I use these tools and how's that going to be for patients? I remember interviewing Peter Lee, who runs AI research for Microsoft. And he said to me, I thought, and I have it in the book, that you really have to think of that non-expert use of these tools is a whole different enterprise than expert use of these tools. And as I watch my daughter go from being a lay person as a medical student to being an expert, you just see, that's your brain is a very different brain. And so, that the choice of what the patient chooses to put into the prompt is totally determinative. And they may come up with a completely different and sometimes wacky answer because they have no idea of the 20 facts at hand, which one goes in. And as a clinician, you instinctively took those 20 facts and distilled it into a prompt that took 5 of them and 5 others, you discard. And it's partly why life is hellish for medical students, because for medical students, they're just on the cusp of becoming an expert, but they have no idea why when they presented a case to their resident and they said, I think this patient has heart failure, but I didn't hear an S3. And the resident says, oh, whatever. Nobody ever hears an S3. But then, the next patient, they say, I think this patient has heart failure, but the lungs were clear. And the resident says, oh my God, this must be a PE. One fact has huge value. Another fact we just have learned to completely discard. And there's absolutely no way a novice knows any of that. And so we really have to think about patient-facing tools in a whole different way than we think about professional-facing tools.
And I think the hope is that this tool won't become a burden to clinicians in a different way of just changing the fundamental way they interact with patients who are coming from different information.
I think it probably will. I think it's going to, patients now, they came in with their Google printouts before. Now they're coming with their GPT printouts. I think they're more likely to have gotten an accurate answer from the GPT printout than what they got from the Google printout. But it's still, a challenge, and you've got to spend the time to kind of work through what did you put in and all that stuff. On the flip side, I have to say, when I come up with a diagnosis and I go into GPT and it says the same thing, it's like, oh yeah, I must be right, which is a little wacky because I've been practicing medicine for 40 years. You would think I'd be more confident in my own answer than this new bot. But, I think in some ways using it as a confirmation of your thinking is somewhat validating.
Absolutely. You talk about all the tools that are out there and a lot of very interesting people doing really interesting work. And it's fun to hear you talk with the experts. But there are some politics and, hegemony going on in the world of AI. We have like the big tech people who, you'd think would be leagues ahead, but are not. You have Epic, who is like the EHR for, it seems like, half the world. So I worry that it might not just be about who has the best tools, but who already has a large enough foothold in the marketplace. It's both a platform and a power story. And so I'm curious, how you think this is going to play out, given the hegemony of Epic as our EHR, and how does that change the equation of which tools get adopted and when?
Yeah, just looking at Sarah, who lives this. Yeah, people sometimes ask, who's going to win this battle? The Google, Amazon, OpenAIs of the world, basically the behemoths, or the plucky venture capital funded startups like a Bridge, who we use for our scribes. And it's like, might be some of both of those, but the real question is Epic. The real question is, you now have a company that has the majority of electronic health record penetration in the US. Every one of US News, quote, top 20 hospitals uses Epic system, and therefore has all the data and has a really remarkably important pole position in the battle to be your AI vendor of choice on a couple of grounds. I mean, one is if Sarah Murray, who's here, who is in charge of AI for our health system, is trying to decide what tool to buy, she knows that if she buys it from Epic, A, it's going to be automatically integrated, so there's no friction about bringing in an outside tool and integrating. And B, she knows that the company is going to be in business 5 years from now in a way that she does not know with a startup. And those are really impressive advantages, and Epic is pressing those advantages. Now, Epic, to their great credit, 5 years ago, they didn't know the first thing about AI or even data analytics. It wasn't what they did. They built an electronic health record. And so I think it would have been easy to be quite skeptical, would they come out with tools that would be good enough? And the first tool that they came out that was generally used was a sepsis decision support tool that completely flamed out and was awful. And there were a few other tools that were like it. So it was sort of logical to be skeptical of how can Epic, company sitting on 1,000 acres of farmland outside of Madison, Wisconsin, that is 2,000 miles away from Silicon Valley, hire the talent to do AI well. And I was talking to a leader of one of the AI startups last week, and he said, "Damn it, they're pretty good. That the tools they come up with are probably not as good as a tool that's built by a company that was formed specifically to build this one tool, but the tools that they build are generally good, are generally useful, are generally trustworthy. It may take a little more time. And again, the company's gonna be in business, and the company is trustworthy. So it's an interesting policy question, because some of their advantage is that they have made it hard to integrate other tools. You can argue whether that's legal or not. They argue it's legal and they're following all the rules and regulations. But I think the world would be a better place if the playing field was flatter, and the startups had an equally easy time of integrating into a system like ours. But you have to give them credit. They've built a system that's quite good. Now, how does the Googles and the Amazons of the world fare? We'll see. The track record is awful. The track record, Google. I was on Google Health's advisory board in 2007, where Google was going to conquer healthcare. And a year into it, Eric Schmidt came in and disbanded us and said, "This is too hard." I was like, "Wow, this must be pretty hard." Google tried, Microsoft tried and flamed out. IBM tried with Watson, flamed out. So the track record of general purpose digital behemoths in healthcare is terrible. And it's partly because of hubris, because they've conquered every other industry. They think healthcare is just like that. They've gotten smarter. They now understand they need clinicians to help them build the tools. They need to understand this wacky world where you need a tool that works on everybody, including people with no insurance who are unhoused or whatever. They never sold tools to people like that before. You need to understand the payment system, the insurance system, the regulatory system. It's complicated. But some of the later tools, the more recent tools that Google has come out with are really impressive. Amazon just rolled out a new AI tool for people in One Medical, which they own, which I haven't played with yet, but I'm told by some One Medical people that it actually works quite well. Amazon has a huge advantage in areas that are in sync with what they do for a living. So buying your drugs from Amazon, like, why would that not be really good? Because buying your books from Amazon is really good and really easy and shows up the next day and it's perfect. So I think they have a real advantage in certain areas, but I think they still have a big disadvantage of being pretty far away from the workflows and understanding how healthcare really works. And they always seem like they're too big to fail, but they always seem to fail. So if I had to put my nickel down, I'd bet on Epic today. I think Epic's position is going to be hard to beat. In part because you want the tools to all integrate together, and that's easier for a single company to do than to have a bunch of different tools bolt on. But when we get to the audience stuff, I'd love to stick a microphone in front of Sarah and see what she says about that.
Absolutely. I know the release of their AI scribe option has probably shaken up the marketplace quite a bit. They're just sitting on so much data, and their ability to get real-time feedback within the EHR is something that feels like a pretty big advantage.
Well, it was interesting that they initially did not say we're going to come out with our scribe, and they partnered with a couple of companies, including the one we went with. And the companies were feeling pretty good about that. And then a year and a half later, they announced they're going to do their own thing. So even in an area that they said we're going to leave this to the market, they want it. And, they've rolled out more than 100 AI tools, and they seem intent in basically being your AI vendor of choice, which is perfectly smart from a business standpoint in terms of where they sit.
One of the things I found most interesting was hearing you talk about Waymo's process of like building a tool, validating, driving hundreds of hours, driving it with someone behind the wheel. Like, that is incredibly painstaking. It takes an incredible amount of data. And you, as a startup AI company, you really need access to all that.
That's partly why radiology has been harder than people thought. That the access to millions of labeled, radiographs, CT scans or MR, whatever it is, has been hard to come by. So it's made the progress of the field slower. I mean, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, which comes first, our radiologists are out of business, or I'm sitting in the back seat of a driverless car taking a nap while it makes a left turn across to Visadero, I would have thought the radiologists are toast. And as I say, I take a Waymo once a week, and we can't hire a radiologist fast enough. So medicine's harder than people think.
I want to make sure to save time for audience questions, but one of the questions that has come up is a lot of tools that we've created, the EHR being one of them. We hoped that there would be enough to serve clinicians in terms of, expedited workflows and ease of ordering. We thought it would serve patients and having their, information all in one place, being able to see their notes, but it has also served insurances and health systems and has been sort of co-opted by the business of medicine and bureaucracy. Do you think AI is more pure than that? Like, who stands to benefit?
Absolutely not.
A way that this could be like our optimism about this will be so good for patients and this will save physicians time. Like, are we getting to a point where, our our prior auth bot is fighting with
Oh, already.
prior auth.
Yeah, no, we have our bot. I mean, like the first day GPT came out, a whole bunch of physicians said, "Thank God it can write a prior auth for me." And it was like, you don't think United Healthcare has its own AI that's going to reject your AI generated prior? And then you have this ludicrous arms race. There is nothing about AI that changes the fundamental dysfunction of the payment system and the perverse motivations of lots of players in the system. And I'd say we're part of that. Like, we'll use AI to improve our billing. And, you know, the reason I sleep at night is if where billing is partly so we can stay solvent and do our research and do our education, all that. But all of the stakeholders will act perfectly according to their incentives. And so for the right now, it feels all almost uniformly good. Like, it is taking a whole bunch of paperwork off our plates, that it can scribe the note, it can summarize a 500-page chart in 30 seconds, it can draft your discharge summary, it can draft your prior auth, it can be this sort of curbside consult in your pocket and give you better information than you could otherwise have. It just seems like, what could go wrong? Well, what could go wrong is what we're talking about now are mostly singles. The real home run here is decision support. The real home run here is the AI says to you, given all these facts, here is the right medicine to use for this patient, or the right test to order for this patient. That is an incredibly value-laden decision. Like, here's a drug, thinking about grand rounds last week, here's a drug for Alzheimer's that slows it down by 6 months, has a 2% chance of causing bleeding in the brain, and costs $30,000 a year. Does the bot recommend that or not? There's a lot of stuff under the hood that's going to determine that, whether we get paid, what the patient's preferences are. So you could certainly see, in a world where the AI is taking on more ownership and agency and decision making, that these are massively consequential decisions. That, you know, a recommendation to use a drug or not use a drug, you know, might be $100,000 delta. Talking about immunotherapies and things like that. And does it or doesn't it? Somewhere under the hood is somebody taking their values and how we get paid and the business case and all that, and inserting it. And maybe even there might even be conflicts of interest. You know, how do we know that a health system didn't get a nice donation from Pfizer as it's recommending a drug? There's just a lot of mischief that can happen here. And the more the tools move out of just helping us do our paperwork and move into the practice of medicine, the dicier this is, and the more opportunities for conflict and more opportunities to be driven by business imperatives rather than clinical imperatives. And I think we just have to watch that super carefully. And probably there needs to be some regulation to be sure that the most egregious things don't happen.
I can't end on that note. Maybe one example of like where we're most wowed or most optimistic about AI.
Oh, the curbside consult thing. I mean, I do think that that the ability of me to walk around on rounds and just have an ID question that I hope that I would run into my favorite ID person in the cafeteria, but I can just pull out my phone and get an answer that may not be quite as good, but is pretty good and good enough for me to use. I find that to be staggering. And that in some ways gives just a hint of where this goes over time. As generalists, I think, can now operate at a level that's closer to that of a specialist, and patients can operate at a level that, if the tools get better, it gets closer to the level of seeing a clinician. Can I read a short?
Well, we'll go to questions.
So this gets at, this is the ending of the book. This gets at a question that Michelle was asking about the future of physicians. And I was pushed by my son-in-law, who's a pulmonary fellow, to write this, because he said the prior ending was a little bit sterile and like, oh, this will work out, blah, blah. And so this was at the end of my time on the wards. Toward the end of my time on the wards, I cared for a 22-year-old woman with severe autism who was nonverbal at baseline. She was brought to the ER by her mother for fever, cough, and lethargy. In her case, the diagnosis of pneumonia was straightforward, as was the choice of treatment, IV fluid and standard antibiotics. I had no doubt that AI could have easily replaced my clinical decision-making. Still, and perhaps I'm being selfish, I treasure having been part of this young woman's care. As she emerged from her near comatose state, her mother's face brightened as she proudly told us that her daughter was back to her, quote, sassy self. Thinking of my own experience as a parent, I tried to put myself at this mom's place. I was awed by her resilience, her ability to find delight in loving a child who would never speak a word, for whom life's conventional milestones would always be out of reach. Lost in these thoughts, I turned toward my patient, only a bit younger than my team of residents and students standing by her bedside. Just then, the patient flashed us a radiant smile and blew kisses to me and my team. As I hope I've made clear, I am convinced that AI's breathtaking and rapidly expanding capabilities will transform healthcare in ways we can barely imagine today, bringing enormous benefits to patients and clinicians and turning our healthcare system into one that, for once, functions reasonably well. By handling myriad administrative chores, allowing patients to accomplish many healthcare tasks independently, and permitting clinicians to be more capable versions of their professional selves, AI is poised to make our system better, safer, more convenient, and less expensive. But I'm equally convinced that, particularly for patients with acute and complex chronic conditions, there will always be a need for a human guide, someone with not only deep medical knowledge and refined clinical judgment, but also the emotional intelligence to recognize and address their patients' unspoken fears, the leadership skills to orchestrate their care across diverse teams, the patience and wisdom to navigate the inherent uncertainties of medicine and healthcare's bureaucratic cul-de-sacs, the uniquely human capacity for deep compassion that transcends both the practical and the algorithmic, and someone to be on the receiving end of a speechless patient's kisses. They will need a doctor. That's how I decided to end this, and I believe it's true.
Hi, I'm Fletcher. I'm one of the chief residents. I had a question. I really enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
We're seeing writers sue AI companies for training on their creative work. In medicine, objective data belongs to nobody, but clinical notes are actually thoughtful, analytical, written work by physicians. They create it. It's a creative act. As health systems partner with AI companies, do you see any ethical or practical ways to recognize or compensate doctors for the creative labor embedded in unstructured data?
Is a spectacular question, one I have actually never heard before. And the analogy is exactly right. I just got a note from some legal settlement for that Anthropic had digested a couple of books that I'd written. I was going to get a check for a couple $1,000, which felt pretty good. Ethical, absolutely. If you think about the work of all of the human beings that go into the system, if your own health system is then taking it and using it to make care better, I don't think you have a really good leg to stand on in terms of being compensated for. You were doing it for that health system, and the health system uses your work all the time to try to make itself better. If it goes to an outside company, ethically, great. Practically, I can't see how that could possibly work. But I think it's a really important question if these companies are getting rich off the backs of clinicians doing a lot of work and labor-intensive work. I think it's a really important point, but practically I can't see that happening. I'd love to hear Julie, and then let's hear Sarah weigh in a little bit on the epic question, but go ahead, Julie.
Got it. So Julie Adler-Milstein. You've sort of alluded to sort of the implications for healthcare costs, but I think, that is probably the greatest crisis facing our healthcare system. And so I'd sort of love to know, as you think about the ledger, ways AI could increase healthcare costs, ways AI could decrease healthcare costs, where do we land? And perhaps more importantly, what do you think is the lever that could most push AI towards decreasing healthcare costs?
Yeah. Well, we are really, really good at not decreasing healthcare costs. So if there's a tool that organizations will use to improve their payments, the incentive system continues to be to do that. What are the mechanisms by which it can lower healthcare costs? I can only think of two main ones. One is labor replacement. And as I come down on the side on the book, I don't think replacing doctors or nurses in the short term is going to happen because the unmet needs are so vast. But if you look at 1,000 people in the billing department or the call center, or in the quality department who are reviewing thousands of charts, there's a lot of labor there that at least theoretically be replaced. The second mechanism is more important, I think, ultimately, which is the old saying is the most expensive piece of technology in a health system is the doctor's pen. It's not the doctor's pen anymore, it's the doctor's fingertips. But the decisions that we make really govern 80% of healthcare costs. And you can imagine AI that drives you to say there are two drugs, one's $5,000, one's $400. The $400 one works as well, and I'm going to recommend that in decision support. That would lower healthcare costs. You could also see a world in which we get paid better for the 5,000, and therefore that's what it recommends. So a lot of this really depends on the incentive system this is embedded in. And I think in a world where maybe payment moves a little bit more rapidly to fixed payments to health systems that then have an incentive to try to save money, then I think the AI will likely save money, but I don't think that's preordained, and I could see this going either way. I think you're absolutely right. The biggest problem in healthcare actually is cost, and if it doesn't do anything about that, then it's of limited utility. Sarah, do you want to say a word about the how you decide on
Sure.
Epic tool versus a third-party tool?
I had a bonus thought too.
Sure, go for it.
Just to get to your IP question, I think there's actually even more pressing IP issues than the data itself, which is that, it is very rare that I can't even think of when it's happened that we've brought in a company where we haven't had to give them a tremendous amount of input with our AI scribe vendors. Like so many of our faculty are engaged, and it's to the benefit of their departments. We want these tools to work, but long term, it's making these companies so much better, right? And so we try to think about like, okay, how do we structure these contracts so that they're favorable to UCSF and they recognize our faculty's contributions, et cetera. But I think it's something that we haven't totally figured out yet. And so it is I think an issue that we should think about.
I should say this is Sarah Murray, who is our Chief Health AI Officer, a job we did not know we needed 2.5 years ago. So what do you, yeah, go ahead.
So for Epic, I think, so the Epic history is long. I mean, Hussein's in the room. He wrote this amazing abstract. I guess it was, 7 to 8 years ago, when he looked at the Epic length of stay model and he was able to outperform it with a pair of dice. And health systems across the country were implementing it. And I gave a grand rounds at an unnamed health center in Colorado. And I was like, well, why are you implementing this? Let me tell you about this abstract Hussein did. And they're like, well, it still must be a little bit helpful. And so that's a tremendous amount of resources that have been wasted on these models, I think, across the country, as we've seen these reports. Those were the early days. I think now, a lot of these Epic tools are just leveraging the same things that all of these companies are, which are the, OpenAI and Anthropic APIs. And so it's hard to think about why we would bring in an external discharge summary tool when Epic has one that's really nicely integrated into the workflow. And actually, I just used it on service a couple of weeks ago, and the output was great. And so I think, we're still testing all of these tools. But the truth is, if we see something on the near-term Epic roadmap, an Epic's tool is a B-, and in the wider arena, we could go with a company that's a B+. We're very unlikely to try to do that because the technical lift needed to do that, the resourcing lift needed to do that is usually not.
And you have some confidence that will go from a B- to a B+ over a year or two?
Some of it does. Yeah. I think, and there's so many things, it's a lot of it is still trying to figure out where do we have true stake and where is it just sizzle? And that's just across the AI space in healthcare right now. But I think a lot of these tools are pretty good. And again, because they're not dependent on Epic technology in many ways, leveraging the same APIs that the AI scribe vendors are leveraging. APIs or connections to these other foundation model companies. I think it's a different game than when, we were looking at the predictive AI where the companies themselves were actually building these models from scratch.
Got it.
We unfortunately are at time, but I'm sure Bob will.
No, I'm going to hang around here. I think some of the house staff wanted to chat about some stuff, so I'm going to hang around here. Anybody who wants to hang around, but thank you, Michelle.
And please join me in welcoming Bob, thanking him for talking about his book today.